G'day there. Today's topic is going to be the NEP, the New Economic Policy, Lenin's answer to the failure of war communism, but also the rise out of certain crises, but into others. Let's go. So the New Economic Policy, as I said, that's Lenin's answer to the failure of war communism. Now, of course, war communism's goal, the reason it was implemented supposedly, was to increase the necessary production of industrial goods for the war front, as well as making sure that the economy itself was sustaining, and also to make sure that agricultural production was meeting the needs of the people, especially the urban workers in the cities, right? Making sure they had enough to eat, so that we could again fuel that that ability to produce in industries, in factories. Not so much about feeding the peasants; they sort of came, third, really. But if we have a look here at this graph, we see the difference between 1913, and remember back to 1913, things weren't going really well industrially or economically back then either, and they certainly weren't going well agriculturally. So when we look at early 1921 and the comparison here between the production of grain, the factory output, and electricity, it's really not a good comparison, right? 1921's not doing very well compared to 1913, which even then, that was pretty poor. One thing that I think astounds me about this graph is considering electricity production 8 years after 1913, right? So in 1921, that should be much, much bigger, right? So by then, they should have been able to implement new technologies, lay lots more infrastructure in terms of, the transfer of energy across different towns and traveling across the countryside, all that sort of stuff. They should have been able to produce much more electricity and take advantage of the modernizing world, I think, around them. But of course, that wasn't successful under the Bolshevik regime, right? So the war communism's agricultural, industrial, and economic goals was an absolute failure. Another thing going on at the time is, of course, the Civil War seems to be about won. Now, it's still going to go on for another couple of years, technically, but Trotsky at least thinks that he's got the White Armies and the interventionists on the run. So even though it's not officially over, it's not really giving them as much of a crisis or grief as it previously was. So the justifications for war communism were a little bit moot. Now, we also see at this time what is giving them a lot of concern is the peasant revolts all around the countryside. So the grain requisitioning that was going on was causing tens of millions of people to starve. Many of those died as a result of these grain requisitions. And so the peasants weren't having it, right? So they were resisting, they were raising peasant armies, the Green Armies. And while they certainly weren't going to win the war against the Reds, they were certainly making a real problem for the Red Armies. So that was something going on at the same time, creating a lot of tension, which was a direct kickback against the policies of war communism. One of the most significant triggers, however, so a really sudden moment that caused the NEP to come into effect, that caused Lenin to act and change his policy, was the Kronstadt Rebellion. So we're going to look at that in detail in a moment, but effectively it's a rebellion, or basically a war effort by loyal communist and socialist sailors and soldiers that for a long time had been very much in favour of the revolution, standing against the government and saying, we want you out and we need you to fix these things. So it was a pretty bloody affair. Now, when we look at the NEP, we're of course going to see some diverse responses. Peasants might feel a couple of different ways. Urban workers loyal to the revolution might feel a couple of different ways. But it was pretty clear from a lot of the party members and the party officials that the NEP kind of contradicted the communist values. But of course, somehow they were able to offer some justifications to the public about this. So let's look into it in detail. So the Kronstadt Rebellion itself, as I said, these were soldiers and sailors that were very famous, effectively, for being, quote, the vanguard of the revolution since 1905. They very much valued these socialist ideals, and they fought for revolution, right? So to have these guys turn around, these guys were claimed to be the reddest of the red, right? When these guys turned around and launched a war against the government, that was a real good clue to Lenin and Trotsky that, okay, things are actually getting out of hand, and perhaps this is not so much a military thing, this is an ideological thing, and we really need to rethink our policies, because not only are they, not popular with the peasants, that was always the case, we're now seeing the workers and the soldiers and the sailors start to get literally up in arms against us about these policies. Now, many of these Kronstadt soldiers and sailors had origins in, the peasant communities themselves. Either they came from peasant communities or their families are still part of peasant communities, so they at least sympathise with what's going on in the countryside. But what they're also starting to realise is the urban workers in the cities are getting a real raw deal as well. But it's hard to find out really accurately what's going on at this time. There's a real strong censorship of the press. There's a lot of, Bolshevik propaganda out there. It's hard to get letters from your, families in remote communities. So the Kronstadt soldiers, sailors actually send a bit of an envoy of soldiers to go and investigate what's going on in the cities. When they come back and report what's been going on and the conditions and the experiences and the corruption of rations and all these sorts of things, they say, righto, time to put our foot down. And they form a petition arguing for the Bolsheviks to finally meet the needs and meet the promises that they made in 1917. Early on with those new decrees, it was looking really good for the socialist values and all the things that they fought for throughout the sort of 1905-1917 revolutions. So ultimately, though, the Kronstadt rebellion was crushed. They only had about 16,000 soldiers, and there was a army of 60,000 red soldiers serving the Bolsheviks, effectively crushing them. So that took a couple of weeks, but they got the job done by the 17th of March, 1921. But Lenin admits here that the Kronstadt rebellion, it wasn't a trivial thing. It wasn't a small thing. He says, we are barely hanging on. These guys are, quote, far more dangerous than all of the Denikins, Udeniches, and Kolchaks put together. So there he's referring to the leaders of a lot of these different white armies and, Kolchak's Siberian forces and all those sorts of, those different interventionist groups as well. So he's saying that this whole civil war that we've been fighting is kind of nothing against what we're dealing with here, because these Kronstadt rebels, they're us, right? They're loyal red factions, essentially, and we're starting to break apart at the seams. So this is a good signal here that we need to do something different, or we're going to fall. We're going to face a new revolution of our own. So the Kronstadt rebellion is a really significant trigger in the implementation of the NEP and the abandonment of the war communism. So really quickly, we'll go through the petition here and look at some of the key things that they were demanding. And you might see that some of these things are just asking for what we asked for in 1905 in Bloody Sunday, right? And a lot of the things that, the Bolsheviks promised to implement in their new decrees anyway. So here were some of the things that they asked for. They said very clearly in Article 1 that the current present Soviet government do not express the will of the workers and the peasants. And they argued for an immediate new election by secret ballot. They also asked for freedom of press and freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly through labour unions and peasant organisations. They also asked to liberate all political prisoners. So they noted that, well, of course, a lot of the other socialist parties had become outlawed and arrested, many already executed, especially if you're part of the socialist revolutionaries, right, or anyone suspected of being sympathetic to the white armies. They demanded also the abolition of the requisition squads. Fair enough. Also, equality in rations. We saw that a lot of corruption was going on. We saw that the ex-bourgeoisie and old capitalists were getting, forced labour, but just about no rations. They were treated like scum and fed just about the same. Right? They were also argued for the abolition of the communist fighting units. So those Chekist machine gunner units, basically standing behind each of the Red Armies as they were going in, and also the communist guards on duty in the mills and the factories. So that really militarized state of someone standing there with a checklist, making sure you're doing things absolutely right, or else ... Right? So getting rid of that really dystopian, totalitarian vibe that was going on. They also argued for full freedom of action in regard to the land of the peasants, so that they can actually do and plant and whatever they want on their own soil. They can control that. And lastly, I've skipped a few, but going to Article 15, to permit free individual production on a small scale by one's own efforts, right? So if it's my farm, or if it's my workshop, or if it's my, small factory, I have the right to control what I produce, how much I charge for it, and how much I get to keep, and who I hire, and all those sorts of things. So basically, free capitalist elements. Now, these people themselves are very much socialist. They still value control and prosperity of the state, but they still think they, as individuals, deserve to be rewarded for their efforts rather than be exploited by the government. And that's what they were seeing was the case through war communism. So this is what the Kronstadt petition was all about, and this is what the sailors and soldiers were arguing for. And it looks like in the NEP, they do get quite a few of these things in. So here are some of the key NEP policies. Of course, they achieve private property rights, private trade, the re-establishment of the currency. So the ruble ends up becoming backed by the gold standard, so pretty effective there. The peasants are allowed and rewarded for generating surpluses. So not only are they allowed to, sell off and encouraged to trade at the market, but they're actually given rewards because, well, we don't want you just making enough food to feed yourself. It's important that you produce a surplus so that gets into the market and there's enough to go around, right? That certainly wasn't the case when they were requisitioning the grain and basically leaving people with barely enough seed to plant for the following harvest, all right? They replaced the requisitions of, basically taking everyone's grain and then sending back bread, which usually didn't happen, with a tax in kind. So it was basically a percentage of somebody's harvest. So not paid in wage, but paid in grain still. So it's different from requisition because it's a percentage now rather than essentially we're taking everything you've got and giving you back supposedly what you need to survive. This way it was a lot better. It encouraged surplus. It encouraged people to create private profit and enterprise. So it was a lot more effective and people were willing to work. Some factories and pockets of industry were still under government control. So that's how Lenin was still able to argue that, no, we're still, in a way, semi-capitalist. He argued that this was essentially a return to the state capitalism that they had back in late 1917, that slow nationalisation process. And we'll see in a moment his justifications for these policies. So Lenin, of course, can't outright say to the public, yeah, war communism failed, communism itself is a failed ideology, and, we're now on the run. He, of course, publicly has to sell this idea to the people and as an effective economic and ideological approach. So he says, you must first attempt to build small bridges which shall lead a land of small peasant holdings through state capitalism to socialism. Otherwise, you will never lead tens of millions of people to communism, right? And I can't disagree with that. He's right. But I think that's the justification he used in 1917 for not immediately implementing hardcore communism overnight. He said that, well, it's not going to happen overnight, leading basically what was a capitalist society of people, dependent on selling their surplus and all those sorts of things to make a profit and to basically survive. You're not going to end that sort of a system overnight, so you need to slowly lead them to the promised land by slowly nationalising and slowly getting socialist government controls over these things. So it's not very different from his original policy. He kind of abandoned that policy for war communism, thinking he could get away with it during the war emergency and during these harvest crises. Privately, however, his justification for it was, well, less of a justification, more of an admission that, hey, we are on the run. He says, the real meaning of the new economic policy is that we have met a great defeat in our plans and that we are now making a strategic retreat. Right, so that's a private conversation that's been documented between Lenin and some of the inside party officials. It's definitely not something that you're going to stand up and preach to the masses, right? But he is admitting there that the war communism failed. In part, our ideology and the way that we try to implement it has failed, and we need to revert to capitalism, basically to save ourselves, because we know that we're facing revolution otherwise, right? Now, of course, there's very diverse reactions. Now, some of the peasants see it, well, many of them see it very much as favourable, of course, because it's going to save their lives. They're no longer being starved to death through requisitions or executed if they refuse to give in to these requisitions. So, of course, they do prefer this system. But, of course, many are still going to be angry about the callousness of the government being able to flip-flop. It's like, well, what do you actually believe in? Because millions of people have literally starved to death as a result of your previous policy that you cared so much about, and now you're just going to flick it on its head and say, oh yeah, no worries, it was all for nothing. So what was it all for? So many people, of course, think the policies are important and they like them and they're going to benefit them, but they're also wondering to the government, are you actually going to acknowledge the suffering that you caused? The workers in the cities, this resulted in better working conditions for them, better rationing, being paid wages now and increased wages in comparison to the previous years. And this also gave them, as paid workers, the ability to buy goods, and not just buy bread, but also goods and household things. So that was able to, of course, stimulate the economy through an open market, which was really effective. But of course, they themselves are questioning, well, we really believed in these ideas, and while it was really tough during this time and we made a lot of sacrifices, we thought it was going to be worth it for this ultimate greater good over the last 3 years. So what was it all for? We've now not arrived at the promised land. We've actually retreated back to what seems to be a policy that goes against what we were fighting for. So what were we doing all this all for? I think many of them are asking. And of course, you have many party officials and members basically seeing this, well, this is just capitalism, or at best quasi-capitalism, and it really does seem to be a betrayal of communist values. They think it's a retreat, a capitulation to capitalism, say that 10 times fast, capitulation to capitalism, and it looks like it's an admission of the failure of communism, and privately, Lenin did make that admission in a sense. So they're very unhappy about this, and although it is quite early by this stage to be having a picture here of Lenin driving the Communist Party, when he does take over, one of the early things he does is, and he can't crap on Lenin straight away. Lenin's still considered the hero and all these sorts of things, and we're going to say that the NEP was necessary to boost production, but as soon as he can justify it and as soon as he can effectively do it, he scraps the NEP and goes hardcore communist, collectivization, death and starvation of millions again, right? So Stalin, I think, secretly hates the NEP at this time, although he's not going to be very outspoken against it, right? Obviously for his own survival. Now, in the end, the NEP was wildly successful. You can see from this graph here, it really does speak for itself. Agricultural production, industrial output, exports and imports all increase as a result of this. So if you look back to 1913, we still haven't met those original figures. And again, they weren't fantastic to speak of to begin with, but it takes a good sort of decade of this policy to really get them out of the dirt there. But you can see straight away in 1921, there's a little boost in production, industrial output, exports, imports, and then over those first couple of years, you see it really rise quite quickly, especially you see agricultural production very much impressively spiking there, as well as industrial output in black. So really, really impressive statistical results there, and you can start to graph that over the next couple of years and over the next decade to see how well that does. But ultimately, the NEP itself, super successful. Now, the last thing that we need to do is just take a look at historians and what they've had to say about these policies. Leonard Shapiro says, the new economic policy was transforming life of the country. The resolution of the Congress virtually restored a system of small-scale commerce in the country. The fact that the peasants could now keep and sell of the free market what remained after the payment of tax encouraged them to increase their production, right? Who would have thought allowing people to profit off of their surplus would encourage you to work harder, right? God, it just blows your mind. I'm getting too ideological there, but it really is just a basic principle, isn't it? There were many in the Communist Party who had accepted it only as a temporary necessity in 1921, when it became clear that the NEP had come to stay for a while. the left opposition inside the party gathered force, right? So we start to see a build-up of people wanting to basically get rid of Lenin. He's going to die in a couple of years in 1924 anyway, but we're going to see a very quick change in policy once Stalin comes to power. And by 1928, he just scraps the whole thing, and it's all gears in the opposite direction. E.H. Carr says the antidote to war communism, familiarly known as the NEP, was a series of measures not conceived at a single stroke, but growing gradually out of one another. So it wasn't this big master plan that they had. It was essentially an immediate knee-jerk reaction where they had to keep on just going, right, we're going to have to do this. Okay, that's working. Let's do this. Okay, fantastic. So it wasn't very much an elaborate scheme. This was an emergency response to the failures of war communism and the pressures put on them by the peasants and the Kronstadt Rebellion. It began by striking at the point of greatest danger as an agricultural policy to increase supply of food by offering fresh inducements to the peasants, right? So the peasants are a big problem at the moment. They're giving us the biggest grief. We need to keep them happy, and we absolutely did that through the NEP. Richard Pipes says, the new regime survived the national revolt by a combination of repression, definitely, and compromise, absolutely. Unrestrained brutality in quelling the rebellions and concessions in the shape of the new economic policy. Ultimately, it was the abandonment of the food requisitioning that pacified the countryside and saved the Bolsheviks. Absolutely. I think at some point, the going gets tough, and the peasants made their voices heard through Kronstadt and the peasant revolts throughout the countryside, and the Bolsheviks definitely heard that message loud and clear, and I think they realised no amount of ideological propaganda and focus on literacy and rights and hey, we're heading to the future, no amount of that sort of just rhetoric was ever going to convince people that their empty bellies were going to be filled by, pretty ideas. So there you have it, guys. That's the NEP, wildly effective, but of course very controversial for the communists in those parties and in those ranks. So cool. Stay tuned next time. We'll discuss a couple more big topics in the Russian Revolution.